for those that are listening or watching that are in a group that has been called a cult, ask yourself this: if this group is the truth, and if they are right, and everything they say is good, then they shouldn't have a problem with me stepping away to take a break and think things through. Because if they're the real deal, they know they are, and I will not find fault with them. I will just reaffirm that they're a good group and eventually go back. If they won't let me do that, and they do everything possible to keep me from doing that, including threatening and intimidating me, and shaming me, what does that say about them?
Welcome to Oops, I'm in a Cult. I'm Scott Barker.
And I'm Charity Navalesi.
We are former members born and raised in the Living Word Fellowship, and we are here to investigate this organization that branded itself as a Christian church for over 70 years, but turned out to be just another cult.
On this episode, we'll be speaking with the internationally known cult expert and deprogrammer Rick Alan Ross, who is the founder and executive director of the Cult Education Institute. Rick has personally assisted thousands of families in an effort to help the victims of destructive cults, groups, and movements.
Ross has been an expert witness in court proceedings across the U.S., including the U.S. federal court, and has been featured in numerous publications, including Time Magazine, People, the New York Times, and appeared on national TV shows like Dateline, 2020, and Oprah.
Ross's analysis has been sought on virtually every major cult story for decades. Let's get to it.
Welcome to the whatever podcast this is.
Are we going to change the title, or are we good with?
We love Oops, I'm in a Cult.
What is this podcast about, though, Charity?
John Robert Stevens.
The Living Word.
The Walk.
It's cults. It's cons.
And corn.
We're talking about a predatory leader who deliberately and knowingly exploits and does harm to people.
You're going to watch as two former cult members try to de-dumbify themselves by doing a podcast about the cult that they were involved in their entire life.
Thought it was a church, turned out it was a cult. Oh, there's a good tagline.
That's what it is. That's it.
Oops, I'm in a cult. We wanted to kind of jump right into the Cult Education Forum, which is how we know of you. Because as a former member, your site was one of the first things that helped me to realize that I was in a cult. Would you like to talk a little bit about why you started that forum? And then maybe we can talk specifically about the Living Word Fellowship thread.
The Cult Education Institute database, which is at culteducation.com, started in 1996. And it was my effort to share all the files and historical information I had on quite a number of groups. And so it was all brought online in 1996. And the idea being to use the internet in a positive way to share information so that people could make more informed decisions about being involved in a group. So that if you were considering a group, you might jump online and look them up, or as they say, Google them, and you would find this information. And it would be historical articles, court documents, personal testimonies, etc. And then the message board was launched sometime after that, and that became a place for anyone to come and share their experiences, ask questions, and also, if you were an affected family, seek out information and support from other people online.
That is actually really genius that you thought of that, when you did, because I think that's exactly the experience that we see, and what came of your form and of the website and the archive and all of that. Because the Living Words form on your thing, you didn't say this already yet, I think, and is this true? And you can verify this if this is true or not. From our looking at it, it's the most visited and posted on form on your website. This one about Living Word. It's like 3.7 million views and 12,000 posts
from Living Word.
Just from the Living Word over 20 years. And what you're describing, finding a place to, learn about the cult that you might be in, is exactly what that did for so many people. So it's really interesting. And I have a question that we weren't planning on asking, but it just made me think of this, was do you think the internet has done a lot for exposing and deconstructing and helping people come out of cults? Does it play a pivotal role?
Well, Scott, it's a two-edged sword. So what the internet giveth, it taketh away. So, you have people that are finding all kinds of information online, and it's helping them, and they're being able to coalesce in kind of support groups online and so on. But you also have destructive cults recruiting online. So it's really the primary way now that cults are recruiting people. And so they use social media platforms like, for example, YouTube to indoctrinate people. YouTube polices their platform to a large extent. But what these groups do is they put up all their videos and they indoctrinate people online. And they also fundraise online. They have Facebook groups. They follow each other on Twitter, X, and it just goes on and on and on. And so there are cult leaders now, for example, Amy Carlton of Love Has Won, who passed away. And you might recall that there was a documentary done about her, Love Has Won. I think it was on Netflix. And also Dr. Phil and I focused on Amy Carlton before that and exposed her publicly. She recruited online. She had thousands and thousands of followers online. She claimed to be God in flesh on earth, and they called her Mother God. And she had an inner circle of people that she really abused horribly, that were her physical group, that were with her at all times. And near her death, she had probably over $1 million in real estate and over $500,000 in cash. And at the time that Dr. Phil and I interviewed her, she was living in a very posh kind of Airbnb in Maui.
And that sounds very familiar.
It rings bells. That kind of rings a little Gary Hargrave bell about him toughing it in Hawaii and living the life.
$3.4 million ocean view home.
A long-suffering disciple.
Yes.
I'm sure the Apostle Paul would see Gary and say, "There you go, Gary, you're taking one for the big man. Right. You're really a sacrificial, suffering disciple." But anyway, another case to point out about the internet is Eligio Bishop. They called him Nature Boy online. And he had a group called Carbon Nation, and it was previously called the Ethereans. And this was a group that completely coalesced and came into being online. He would recruit people online. At the time, I testified against him as an expert witness in court in Atlanta not long ago, where he was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and rape and sentenced to life without parole. He had 35,000 followers on Twitter. Wow. And then he was very active on Facebook, on YouTube. He had his channel. They would toss him off periodically, but he was really all in online. And then he created compounds from Airbnbs that he would rent first in Mexico, I think, Panama, then Costa Rica. And eventually these countries would deport him. And he would end up back in Atlanta, where he exploited and abused, in particular, the women members of the group, though he abused the men as well. Mm-hmm. But Eligio Bishop could not have existed without the internet. Mm-hmm. That was his lifeblood. That sustained him. So the internet, on one hand, is a wonderful tool to educate people and help people and support people. But on the other hand, cults are using it as well.
Sure. I mean, in the case of the Living Word Fellowship, it was ultimately what took it down, because I'm sure you're aware, not only the forum, which members were warned from the pulpit not to look at because it was going to poison our minds, but it was Facebook that ultimately brought down the cult by, Shalom Abrahamson initially posting those letters and then hundreds of us following suit. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever seen anything like that, and how it happened so quickly?
Oh,
it was
yes.
Within 2 weeks.
Yeah, no, it has happened before through the forum. There have been a number of groups that have been exposed on the forum. There was a group called Richmond Outreach Center, and it existed in Richmond, Virginia. And the leader of that group was found guilty of raping minor children. And the first exposure that I'm aware of was on the forum at culteducation.com. That was where people began to talk about the sexual abuse they experienced. And they were eventually able to bring down the leader of that group, who is, last I heard, is in prison. I'm trying to remember his name. His father also ran a ministry, but it was called Richmond Outreach Center, or it was frequently referred to as The Rock. And there have been other groups like that were brought down through people finally meeting each other and comparing notes.
Exactly.
and realizing that they were not alone through the message board.
Yeah. Have you been the target of cults, or the website been a target of cults? Because I know for us, Gary was trying to shut you down or minimize our access, as former members to the forum. Have you been, the target from cults?
Yes, I can talk to you about that. By the way, the leader of The Rock, I now recall his name, Geronimo Aguilar.
Oh, wow.
And if you Google him, you'll see that he was convicted of rape of children and sentenced to and his father's name was Phil Aguilar, who led something called Set Free Ministries, which was also quite controversial, though he was a kind of a TV star on Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, which was started by you might recall, Jan and Paul Crouch, who were Assemblies of God. Have I been pursued by groups angry with me that they've been exposed online? I've been sued 5 times. In fact, in 2004, 3 different groups called cults were suing me simultaneously. Nexium, led by Keith Raniere, a notorious cult leader, perhaps one of the most notorious in recent years, who's now serving a more than 100-year sentence in federal prison for sex trafficking, racketeering, fraud. He sued me for 14 years, Scott.
Wow.
And then I was sued by Landmark Education, a ministry called Pure Bride Ministries, a group called the Church of Immortal Consciousness in Arizona. And I was also sued by a kind of new agey group called Gentle Wind Project in Maine. And all of them had the same goal: get the material about us and take it offline. We do not want anything about us on your website. We don't want anything visible, and you need to take it down. In the case of Keith Raniere, there were 2 doctors, a clinical psychologist, Dr. Paul Martin, who founded a rehabilitation retreat for former cult members called Wellspring in Albany, Ohio, and a forensic psychiatrist, John Hockman, who was a professor at UCLA. They wrote papers analyzing Keith Raniere's training that he instituted in Nexium. And they both came to the conclusion that he was a cult leader and that he was basically brainwashing people. And so Ranieri was desperate to get that information taken down. And so he threatened me, and then he sued me. And
how did that work out for everybody, for all of them?
All of those lawsuits were dismissed. None of them ever went to trial. And the purpose of those lawsuits was to harass me. And they thought cost me a great deal of money. I can tell you that if I had to defend myself in just the NXIVM suit and pay the legal bills, it would have exceeded $2 million. Ranieri spent $5 million harassing me that we know of, including having a private investigator stalk me, surveil me, buy my garbage, illegally penetrate both my private banking accounts and my phone. So, which they later were sued for and settled, that private investigation company called Interfor in New York City. So at any rate, I've been sued 5 times by different groups. I have thankfully been represented pro bono, which means attorneys agreed to represent me for free. And if it wasn't for them, God bless them and keep them because they were absolutely my saviors.
Yeah.
You know, they came and they protected me and they didn't even charge me for stamps. Wow. I mean, there was nothing that they charged for. And
it's got to be exhausting to deal with all of that. I mean, at least the money's covered and the legal fees are covered, but how do you keep doing what you're doing? Because how long have you been going for?
Scott, I've been doing this for over 40 years.
Yeah.
So I have been under the protection of the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and because of death threats. I mean, I have been stalked. I've been under surveillance. I have been threatened many, many times. And so it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah.
But the rewards for it, I think, are very, very meaningful.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about people that, in my estimation, are evil incarnate. People who have no empathy, no sympathy, no conscience, who wantonly hurt people with absolute disregard for the consequences they create for other people. Heartless people.
It's interesting. It's interesting to think, Charity and I were born into a cult, and it sounds like, from what I understand, you're willingly putting yourself into these positions with these people. Why does that? I mean, is this something like, what is the motivation? I know you had your origin story I've read about is about your grandmother. Is that right? And all of that. What keeps you kind of moving through this, and like, as helpful as it is for people like us, what keeps you motivated?
Just looking at the results. Looking and realizing that people's lives have been changed for the better, that people have been put away in prison. I testified as a fact witness at the trial of Keith Raniere, and I looked at him from the witness stand before he went to prison for the rest of his life. And I can be honest with you and say that gives me satisfaction. He's an evil man. He had 150 women that were locked into a sex slave group within the cult. It was like a cult within a cult. 50 of the women were tortured. They were branded with a cauterizing iron with no anesthetic, strapped to a gurney screaming while he took videos and watched. I mean, we're talking about a sadist. We're talking about the worst kind of misogynist I've ever dealt with. We're talking about a psychopath. And so in order to, fight against somebody like that, you take a few hits and, let the chips fall where they may. And in the end, I'm sure he thought he would destroy me multiple times, financially wreck me, bankrupt me, whatever. Some of my lawyers thought he imagined possibly killing me.
Wow.
So the end result was he's in prison and I'm continuing my work, and he's not able to hurt anybody anymore. And there was a period in time when he was like a king over more than 1,000 people. There were hundreds of women that were abused by him. I mean, this was somebody who was a pathological beast, and this is how many of these cult leaders are.
Yeah. So that's a very extreme cult situation. And I'd be curious to know, because having been born and raised in the Living Word Fellowship, one of the things that's been really difficult for a lot of us in coming to terms that we were in a cult is that it mirrored a church just enough, because nothing about it was super extreme. It was all very subtle in some ways. Although if someone came from the outside, they'd be like, oh, this is kind of culty. But it was very difficult for a lot of people to accept that the Living Word Fellowship was a cult, because it was not so extreme as some of these examples that you're listing. But it was in fact very dangerous. And a lot of these things, like the mental, emotional, of course, there was the sexual abuse also, but so much of it was subversive, under the radar. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on why a group like this, like the Living Word Fellowship, is dangerous, even though it's not overtly these other ones that you're speaking about.
Well, let's just say that John Robert Stevens was a very charismatic man. He was a dynamic preacher. And he was at one time affiliated with Foursquare, the Assemblies of God. So there was this patina of respectability about him, that he had that kind of denominational background. But he embraced the latter rain movement and became involved with people like William Branham. And Branham, like Stevens, was, a very charismatic preacher. He was regarded as a prophet. People thought he had supernatural power. And this is the beginning of what becomes a cult. That is, a charismatic leader that becomes an object of worship, is a dictator, and has no meaningful accountability. That's the single most salient feature of a destructive cult. Now, there are two more core characteristics that form the nucleus for the definition of a destructive cult. And they are, number two, that this charismatic leader that becomes an object of worship, it uses his influence to basically break people down, change them, and mold them to what he wants, which is subservient, submissive pawns that he can use and in many situations abuse. So the first is this all-powerful leader. The second is the use of what I'd call coercive persuasion or thought reform to gain undue influence. And then finally, the last is the destructive nature of the group. So you might have a group that could be considered a benign cult with a charismatic leader that uses coercive persuasion, but somehow doesn't hurt people or exploit them. I've seen groups like that. They're very rare, but they exist. But typically, if you have an all-powerful leader who has no accountability, the abuse will begin eventually because there are no checks and balances. For example, financial transparency, democratic governance with bylaws, and people that can fire the pastor and say, look, you're not performing. We have a board. We're elected. We're serving fixed terms. And we will audit the money. And we will also respond to complaints about you, you might get fired. So you take away that, you have a dictatorial leadership, you have people under undue influence. And the way you can see that undue influence is people acting against their own best interest, but consistently in the interest of the leader and the hierarchy in the group. So they're not doing what they should for their own well-being. They're acting against what is good for them, but it's good for the group. It's good for the leader. And the abuse, it varies by degree from group to group. So as you pointed out, Charity, one group like Nexium could be much more destructive and much more extreme than another group. But let's just say that it might be 1 to 10, with 10 being a group that kills people, that withholds medical care and children are dying, or is planning some kind of mass suicide. That would be a 10. But simply because a group is a 1 or a 2 or a 3 doesn't excuse the abuse that they do, right, which could be affecting people's educational life, their job, their career, causing estrangements in families, divorces between couples, abusing the kids as they're growing up with harsh punishment and harsh discipline, or for that matter, socially isolating people within the group in a way that really stunts their emotional and psychological growth.
I think all of that would describe the Living Word Fellowship perfectly. And what's interesting about what you said about bylaws and having a board in place, the Living Word Fellowship technically had that. However, Gary and Marilyn Hargrave always had veto power. And everybody who was on the board, the Apostolic Company, for example, would always defer to Gary and Marilyn. So it really was never democratic. It gave the illusion of that. But it's not what happened in practice. It was all kind of there for show, is what it seems like.
Well, when I was working with families in Grand Forks, North Dakota, to take on a group that many called a cult called Victory Church in Grand Forks. And in fact, when I worked with Oprah Winfrey and we exposed the leaders of this group, they were a couple by the name of Julison that, ruled over the church. Renee Julison in particular, the wife, was the powerful, charismatic leader, though her husband, Ed Julison, also participated. And they actually had 4 medical doctors in the church, and I think 2 or 3 of them were on the board. And I would eventually meet and work with these doctors as they exited from Victory Church, and they would tell me all we did was rubber stamp Renee and Ed. That's it. We just deferred to them, whatever they wanted, blah, blah, blah. Well, eventually, with Oprah Winfrey's help, Victory Church collapsed, and the Julisons left Grand Forks. A church that once included over 400 members ceased to exist.
Awesome.
And many of the children that were born into that church were badly abused. They were not treated well. And so that was one of the issues with that particular church. And let me just back up and respond to something that you said, Charity, which is, look, it's Christian. It's a church. Well, keep in mind that is a way that many cult leaders wear a mask. It's a facade. They tell you that they're about the Bible, they're about God, they're on the team with Jesus, that they're like a disciple, a prophet, whatever. And you buy into it because the United States, for example, and Western countries are largely Christian. And so by using the Bible and the name of Jesus and God, you are, soliciting obedience because you're using that authority. But Jesus said in the New Testament, many will come in my name and I will not know them. And they will be wolves in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very good description of many of these leaders, because what they will do is they will tell you, if you disobey me, you disobey God.
That's exactly what was
If you
told
don't
to
agree
us.
with me, you are in sin, because you
Absolutely.
have the sin of pride and rebellion, and you're coming against God. And so they make you feel that you must obey them in order to be true to your faith and true to God. And
That's
so many
absolutely right.
people will say to me, how can people turn on their family, turn their back on their family, and be in this particular group? And I'll say, well, because they twist the scriptures. They'll quote Matthew and say, I have not come to bring peace but a sword, and I will put family members against each other, blah, 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 which in no way really describes what they're doing, because they're saying it's allegiance to me, an individual, and my organization. It's not about God.
Right.
And so people believe when they obey the leader, even if it means turning on their own family members, that they are not rejecting their family members heartlessly. They are being obedient to God, and they are choosing God first over their family.
I have a question. As you are a cult expert that works with all of these cults all across the country. It's the internet's not stopping them. You know, they pop up like in many different ways along the different scales, to like mass suicide down to lower level control and all of these types of things. What is it, and especially when they hide in the majority religion in America of Christianity, and I know they're in all the other religions, of course, too. What is it about? Do you think there's something unique about America itself? Or is there something that we can do? Is there anything we can do institutionally in America to, you know, kind of suppress some of this cult-like stuff, or catch it earlier, or stop it altogether?
Well, you know, Scott, I think that if I were going to single out something about the United States, it's our intense commitment to religious freedom and the First Amendment protection that it provides. So there are many groups that use the First Amendment and use their religious status to protect themselves. So, for example, they don't pay taxes, they don't pay property tax, they don't stand the same scrutiny as an educational nonprofit because they're a religious nonprofit. So they have special protection, special status. And then if the government or anyone really looks into what they're doing and questions them, they say, well, that's persecution. You're persecuting me because I'm religious and you don't agree with me. And I would say, no, that's not true. It's about your behavior. You can believe whatever you want, but you cannot do whatever you wish in the name of your beliefs. And so what we're seeing in the US and around the world in recent years are cult leaders being prosecuted and sent to prison. Chad Daybell, the notorious cult leader who, basically hypnotized Lori Vallow, who they referred to as cult mom, and then they killed her children, and Chad Daybell killed his wife. He is sentenced to death in Idaho. So he is going to have to pay for his crimes. Mm-hmm. And there have been many other cult leaders who have been prosecuted. And also there are cult leaders who are being sued civilly, as you know, and they're also having to either pay settlements or the juries are finding them guilty and levying judgments on them. So I think we're seeing more accountability for cult leaders than we have in decades past. That's my experience. And I think what we all need to do is just be more aware of what defines a cult and how they try to manipulate and control people, so that we can understand what we need to be wary of if we come across a new group or someone wants to introduce us to a new group.
Maybe even just, like the work that you're doing, and there are more documentaries out, and like this part of our intention with this podcast is just to educate people on what a cult is, because sometimes it just isn't immediately obvious.
What I would say is that if you get involved in a group and you feel that they're pulling you away from your old friends, your family, and you're becoming socially isolated, that would be a warning sign. If you become involved in a group and they have a charismatic leader who is really being worshiped and fawned on, and you can see that no one even entertains the idea of criticizing that leader, no matter what they do, and that even to doubt that leader is seen as a negative, that's a warning sign. If you get involved in a group and you find out that people that have left are being negatively stigmatized all the time, and you finally realize the group doesn't think there's any legitimate reason to leave, no matter what, I mean, that's a warning sign as well.
Yeah, that's all of those things. I think we even did an episode where we took your 10 signs and we broke them down and pointed to all the stuff in the living word. And these items that you kind of list out are to the point, and they are exactly right. Especially after the fact, you can go back and see these things. But the question, I think, a little bit is for Charity and I, we were born into this thing. Somebody that joins, many of the people that were part of the Living Word were a part of it for decades before they slowly were able to pull themselves out of it. If you're born into it, this thing of brainwashing, it is very hard. Many of us knew that you couldn't question the leader. We knew that when you got kicked out or when you left, you were not allowed, we weren't allowed to talk to you anymore. We knew that stuff. You could see those things. We even had friends and family coming up to us and being like, hey, you're in a cult. And that still happens today, not just with the Living Word, obviously with hundreds of other cults, big, small, nationwide, whatever. They are happening. It's happening all the time. And you could go up to a person and you can be like, you're in a cult. And this is why, this is why, this is why, this is why. Not going to work at that level.
It's really, really tough. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about deprogramming, because I know that's something you do. What it means to be brainwashed too. That to me was something being brainwashed my whole life. How was I supposed to know that I was brainwashed? What does that mean?
Look at Leah Remini. She left Scientology. She was raised in Scientology, and now she's kind of their worst enemy. And that must have been very tough on her. But she was lucky. She was able to bring her family out with her. And many people can't do that. Probably the saddest stories are from a group called the Children of God. This was a group that also broke away from the Assemblies of God, led by this preacher named Moses David Berg, who was a pedophile. He molested his daughter, he molested his granddaughter, and held her prisoner. I met her. And River Phoenix and his brother Joaquin Phoenix were literally brought into this cult by their parents. And of course, the leader mandated the sexual abuse of children. And in one interview, River Phoenix said, I lost my virginity when I was 4. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to people who were raised in the Children of God, were very, very bitter. And some of them self-medicated. And that's what happened to River Phoenix. He was a great actor. He was nominated for an Oscar. He was the older brother of Joaquin Phoenix, who won an Oscar. And he probably would have won an Oscar eventually himself, River Phoenix, if he had not died at the age of 26. which happened because he, in my opinion, he was self-medicating. He was numbing himself out, as many of the people that I would talk to did that left the Children of God, because on one hand, they loved their parents, but on the other hand, they resented and even hated their parents for subjecting them to this cult. So what do you do with that? It's very, very, very difficult. And I would say the first step, and this is what deprogramming is all about, it's education. You need to educate yourself. What is a destructive cult? And you then look at that definition, which I've given, which is based on the writings of Robert J. Lifton, who taught at Harvard and published a paper called Cult Formation that you can find online, in which he identified those three core characteristics that are the foundation or the nucleus of any definition of a destructive cult. And so you ask yourself, do these things apply to the group that I was in? How do they apply? Why do they apply? And then the next thing you do is you read the literature on what we call brainwashing, but what is really a synthesis of influence techniques, coercive persuasion, and thought reform. And so you read the seminal literature. For example, Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, the book Coercive Persuasion by Edgar Schein, who taught at MIT, and the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, written by Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who taught at Harvard. And
so this, though, sorry if I can interrupt, is that all of this, the education part of it, especially, as we talked about before, when you're in a cult, part of it is not allowing other information into your experience. So how does somebody who is a current member, I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying like the only way to you have to somehow draw the attention of somebody that's in a cult away from the cult. But that's the whole point of a cult, is to lock you in and focus you in on the leader. What do you do if you're, let's say, a friend or a family is in that place? Like, how do you get their attention? How do you start that process of deprogramming or helping, or should you, is maybe one question.
Well, look, Scott, most people that say I was in a cult were not deprogrammed. Most people that were in a cult left because they decided that something wasn't quite right. Something was off. Something didn't square. And they had continuing doubts and conflicts over what was going on in the group. And then they reached a critical point, or you could say critical mass, where they realize, I need to take a break. I need to unplug, which is the key. That is the key. I'm going to unplug, and the group will no longer control my social environment. I will take a break from the group. And during that time, I'm going to educate myself. What are cults? How do they manipulate people? And so on. And is there meaningful research out there about my group that I have not read, that the group doesn't want me to read for whatever excuse they provide, that I really should read, must read, in order to have a more informed understanding about the history and the behavior and the problems in my group? And then finally, if you know people that are outside of the group, why did they leave? What were their concerns? If you have family members that left, sit with them, talk with them. Now, when I do an intervention, it's very different. The person that I'm working with has no intention of leaving the group. They're completely under the group's influence and control. So what I do is exactly what I just outlined. There are 4 blocks to the intervention. One block is defining a destructive cult. Another block is cultic manipulation and control. Another block is research on that specific group. And the fourth block is, why did your family stage this intervention? What are their concerns? Why am I here? And that may take 3 to 4 days, 6 to 8 hours a day to cover that material. And the person I'm working with typically, you could say, has been tricked or certainly not informed about, the intervention. In other words, the family or spouse or adult children have not told their family member, we're going to stage an intervention. Very similar to a drug or alcohol intervention in that regard. So it begins as a surprise, and you stage it when that person is visiting, they're somewhere away from the group, and then you begin this intervention, and you hope that they will agree to stay and listen. And of course, the family pleads with them. They say, look, we love you, and we're very worried about you, and we would very much appreciate it if you would just give us some time to express our concerns and to talk. And we've asked this expert to sit in and help us. And that's what happens in an intervention.
That's got to be really scary for somebody who's being intervened. Yeah. That to suddenly find that, especially if you're part, I know that it could almost seem like, who do I trust? The people in the cult are my family. They've told me all the secrets to the universe and whatever. They got me in on this side. And my family, I've almost already been told, are the bad guys. And now they've locked me in the room. They've got this scary guy in here. He's going to brainwash me and I'm going to join his cult. How do you bring them around to feel safe in that and show them the reality of the situation?
Well, first, I don't act scary. I mean, I really don't. I try to be low key. I try to be calm and just step and tread gently. And then what I would say to that person is, look, I don't have any organization or group that I'm here to recruit you into. I'm not here to make a judgment about what you should believe, whether you should be a Christian, a Jew, a Hindu, a Muslim, or an atheist. I'm just here to discuss the group in question, the leader in question, and how that might be helpful to you in kind of sorting this out. And despite the fact that I'm a surprise and your family staged this without informing you, the end result of this period of time will be you making the decision what you're going to do. You will decide either to continue with the group, not to continue, take a break, whatever. It's up to you. All I'm going to do is share information with you, and then I'm going to go bye-bye. I'm not going to be a part of your life and try to be your new leader. That's not my role, and that's not why your family brought me here.
Well, in some cases, I think even just giving the person space away from the cult gives just a little crack of perspective that can then start the wheels turning, where you start to think more objectively about what you're a part of, and you're not being constantly bombarded with all of the indoctrination of the group, the group think and all that. But one thing that I've noticed with a lot of former members from our cult, or people who are still even loyal to, say, Gary Hargrave or the teachings of John Stevens, is their identity is so deeply embedded in these beliefs and in this organization that they don't know who they are without it. And so it's just almost like losing their entire self to let it go, or to acknowledge that it was toxic and that it was a cult. What advice would you give to someone who's struggling with that, with their identity after leaving a high control group like this?
Well, in my book, Cults Inside Out, there's a chapter on abusive controlling relationships. And then I describe an intervention that I did with a woman to get her out of an abusive, controlling relationship. Listen, I've met with people that have been in abusive, controlling relationships for many years. And you talk about embedded ideas and loyalties. The women that I've worked with, though on occasion I've worked with men, but typically it's a woman, and the woman is being abused, controlled, manipulated, and exploited by a man, often her husband, who isolates her from her family and old friends, zealously kind of is her gatekeeper, dominates her, and gaslights her, which is a form of kind of mystical manipulation or planned spontaneity, in which the person who's gaslighting you tells you something with the intent of affecting the way you perceive the world, the way you think of yourself. And they're manipulating you and you don't realize it. So, for example, typically a woman that is in an abusive, controlling relationship, her husband, her partner, is always chipping at her self-esteem, creating doubts, questioning what she does, what she thinks, how she dresses, and so forth. So, I mean, when you're talking about an intimate relationship with a partner that you love and that you believe sincerely loves you, to break away after many years is so tough. That is really tough. I mean, Tina Turner, the rock star, when she broke away from Ike Turner, that was her whole sense of identity, was being with Ike Turner. I mean, he was with her from the time that she was like 17 years old, and she had children with him and so on. It's very, very tough what you're describing, to break away from an abusive, controlling partner, or to break away from an abusive, controlling, authoritarian group that has dominated you to the extent that your identity and the group are fused. So what you have to do is step away, take a break, and for those that are listening or watching that are in a group that has been called a cult, ask yourself this: if this group is the truth, and if they are right, and everything they say is good, then they shouldn't have a problem with me stepping away to take a break and think things through. Because if they're the real deal, they know they are, and I will not find fault with them. I will just reaffirm that they're a good group and eventually go back. If they won't let me do that, and they do everything possible to keep me from doing that, including threatening and intimidating me, and shaming me, what does that say about them? That's the behavior of a group that has something to hide, that doesn't want me to be able to think for myself and be not subject to their control.
That's right. Well, along those same lines, like for those of us that were born and raised in it, so much of this is embedded in us. Like many of us struggle with like very low self-esteem, anxiety, PTSD, all of these things. And also the, who am I? Who am I really, and not what these people told me that I am? And can I ever, like, this is something Scott and I, it's a hard question to ask because it's a little scary, but like, can I ever get the cult out of me? Or am I forever imprinted with this because it's all I knew for so long? What is me? How do I differentiate what is me and what is what the cult taught me that I don't even realize on a conscious level?
Well, at Charity, it takes time. It just takes time to unpack it, sort it out, and find who you are and what you care about. I mean, look at Tina Turner. It took her years to overcome the abuse that she had as her everyday life with Ike Turner, but she became a phenomenal success. And I think the first thing is to not beat yourself up, to not say, how could I be such a idiot? How could I allow myself to be manipulated by this person or this group or this leader? What's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. We're talking about someone who's a predator. We're talking about a predatory leader who deliberately and knowingly exploits and does harm to people. And that's not something that's your fault. That's someone who is a perpetrator. I would liken it to being a rape victim. There's nothing to justify rape, period, full stop. If someone is raped, they are not responsible. It's the rapist. It's the predator. It's the perpetrator. So the first thing is stop blaming yourself. Stop shaming yourself, because what you're doing is perpetuating the control of the group, the control of the leader. They want you to feel shame. They want you to feel you need them to fix you. You need them to make you right. No, you don't. They're the source of the problem. You need to step away and unpack this. And constantly, as you're unpacking it, take each thing that you feel, each emotion, each thought, and then compare it to the framework of thought reform, coercive persuasion, the literature on destructive cults, and ask yourself, is this parallel to that? Is this like that? And if it is, what does that mean? It means that these people preyed upon me. They exploited me. They're to blame. I'm not to blame. And what happened to me has happened to millions of victims like me. I'm not the only one. And you look at the survivor stories about people who not only got out, but went on with their lives, and they tell you how they did that. And you say, well, I can do that too. Why not me? And, it's a process. And that's why podcasts like this one and articles and documentaries and everything that tells the survivor stories, that's why it's so important to let people know that there is a pathway, that there is a way to make your life whole, and that you don't need to sit around feeling ashamed for something that you did not do, but that instead was done to you by someone of questionable moral character and probably a sociopath, and in many cases a psychopath. And I think at the end of the day, this is something Dr. Phil taught me. And I think he was right. He said, at the end, there must be forgiveness. And when I say forgiveness, I don't mean that means that you forgive someone like Gary Hargrave and say, oh, Gary, you're a great guy. I forgive you. Let's have lunch. No, what I mean is, Gary, I think maybe you're a sociopath or a psychopath. You're a broken guy. And you may have a big house in Maui or whatever. Good for you. And I forgive you for being who and what you are, because I recognize that you probably will never change. And that's just who you are. And Gary, good luck with that. Or as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? And Gary might say, well, it's working pretty good. I've got the money and I've got a place in Hawaii. But, I would say to him, yeah, but Gary, are you really doing what God wants? Are you really a godly and good person? I don't think so. You might put that out there, but I don't think so. And you probably know that deep down inside.
Do you think so? Do you think that these cult leaders like Gary Hargrave are intentionally and consciously manipulative, or are they unaware of their own toxicity and that they are? I guess sociopaths don't know they're sociopaths, right? I don't know.
Well, they know when they're lying. They know when they're manipulating people. They know when they're stealing. They know. I mean, if they're a pastor, supposedly, a man of God, They know what the 10 Commandments say. They know what Jesus preached on the Sermon on the Mount. They know. And so they know when they're not following that path and when they're going against what the Bible teaches, or they're going against the law and they're not obeying civil authority, which the Bible teaches them to do. So in my opinion, having met cult leaders like Keith Raniere face to face and having dealt with them for many years, I believe that they know what they're doing, and they know what they're doing is hurting people. And quite frankly, they don't care.
Right.
They don't care. And that's the part of them that is sociopathic, that is like a psychopath. And most of them, if you look up narcissistic personality disorder, you will see the traits of someone with NPD, and you'll go, oh my God, that's my leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like that. He's a narcissist. And many of them are what we call malignant narcissists, which simply means a narcissist on steroids, that is really, really bad. So what Dr. Phil meant when he said, I think, forgiveness, is he meant just acknowledge that this is who they are. They will never change. They cannot function in any other way. And you just say, I forgive you and I let you go. And it allows you to just move on without them in your life, in your thoughts, in your heart, maybe as much. And I think that can be a kind of final phase. But initially, what you must do is understand thought reform, influence techniques, coercive persuasion, what is gaslighting, how does it work? You need to know those things so that you can understand what they did to you. And then you can reverse it by recognizing it and saying, I will not cooperate with that. I will not feel shame,
Would you say, too, if you don't go through that process, that you just would, easily find yourself in another cult-like dynamic if you don't work to heal those things inside of you?
That's usually the narrative. If you meet somebody that is what I would call a cult hopper and they go from one cult to another, that's their story. They never unpack their shit. They just didn't do it. Mark Vicente, who really was helpful in getting so many people out of NXIVM and was the documentary maker for NXIVM, and he participated in the HBO documentary, which I also was in, called The Vow. Mark Vicente, when he was very first leaving NXIVM, he called me on the phone. I'll never forget it. It was, about 2015, something like that. And we would talk for hours. And he said to me, Rick, I was in a cult before NXIVM. It was called Ramtha School of Enlightenment, led by J.Z. Knight. And I did a documentary for her that became kind of famous called What the Bleep. And I eventually left that group thinking it was bad. And then how did I end up in NXIVM? Because Mark said to me, I would say that NXIVM was certainly as bad as J.Z. Knight and Ramtha, and probably worse. I mean, J.Z. Knight wasn't torturing and branding women. She was arguably exploiting people, but not doing that. And so Mark said, I want to make sure that I don't join any more cults. I'm middle-aged. I don't want to be a middle-aged and then an old-age cult hopper. So it seems to me, and he told me this, he said, when I was in the group, they said you were like Satan. So when I realized that Keith Raniere was bad, I thought, well, maybe this guy might be good. And he's got information that can help me. So Mark went through my book, and he really kind of got a handle on what happened to him. And I don't think that Mark will join another cult because he did that.
It's an important process. Layers probably to it, just like take it bit by bit, and you have realizations. This is what's happened for me over the years, is like bit by bit realizing, oh, that's from the cult, and this pattern, because the pattern can play out then, like me being raised in a cult, I can play out that same dynamic, say in a romantic relationship.
Yes.
Or just always wanting someone to tell me like what I should do, or always needing outside validation to feel like I'm okay. It's like recognizing those patterns that are from being raised in a cult, and then working to heal those patterns, then I'm sure not to repeat them in any other like area of my life.
And one thing that people do in recovery therapy, and there are a number of professional counselors that provide therapy and counseling for former cult members, there's actually a directory under getting help, and then under recovery, there's a directory of recovery resources with those professionals listed at culteducation.com. But what they will do with someone who's left the group, and this isn't blaming, this is just understanding. What are your vulnerabilities that gave the cult a crack that they could drill into and leverage? That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. That doesn't mean you're to blame. What it means is that we all have vulnerabilities. And when we recognize what our vulnerabilities may be, like I find it very hard to say no to someone. I'm easily shamed. I'm an introvert, and that's my vulnerability because I need to have alone time. Or I'm an extrovert and I need to be around people, and I need that, and that's my vulnerability. So you identify what your vulnerabilities are in order to recognize if someone starts to exploit that in their relationship with me, that's a red flag. That's going to be my warning sign. And also to recognize that sometimes we're more vulnerable than we are at other times. We all are. And that when we're in a vulnerable state, that is not a time to join a new group or meet a new romantic interest. And first you want to sort it out, heal yourself, be stronger, and recognize your vulnerable period or a rough patch in your life. Because if there's one narrative that pulls through many of the people that I've worked with, and I've worked with people who had Ivy League diplomas, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Wharton. I've worked with medical doctors, 5 medical doctors that I deprogram. So they're not stupid people. But if I were to take a thread and pull it through the narrative of many of these victims, it would be, I was at a difficult time in my life, and I had the bad luck to run into somebody that told me about this group, this leader, this church, whatever, that turned out to be a cult. I trusted this person. They were a coworker. They were a family member. They were an old friend. They were someone I was romantically interested in. And as a result, I was open to hear what they had to say. And they didn't tell me the truth about the group. They were deliberately deceptive, or the group was deceptive, and they bought into that deception as a true believer. And then they pulled me in. And I didn't know what I was getting into. Nobody says, oh, yeah, I knew it was a cult. And I thought, I want to be in a cult. And I'm going to join this cult. No. They thought it was a real legitimate group. And the group withheld important information that if they would have known it from the very beginning, they would never have moved forward. So there's all this deception. And then there's all this manipulation after the deception or along with the deception. And it's a process that is step by step, layer by layer, in increments. And once you get sucked in, you don't see it because everybody around you is reinforcing what is going on and saying, hey, it's great. This is where God is. This is where God is moving. The Holy Spirit is moving here. And you're looking at all the people around you and they're saying, yes, yes. And so you don't get accurate feedback. You can't do a reality check. That's why it's important to unplug, like I previously said. And it also explains how crazy things go on inside this bubble that's an alternate reality that is reinforced by social isolation and peer approval and peer pressure. Right. And this is what Lifton describes as milieu control, or control of the environment, which is the foundation of thought reform that we call brainwashing.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That is really beautiful. I mean, what you're describing there is so much of what many people have shared with us. And we've heard that same thing, like you just said, where people sit, we've heard this so many times, people sit in the audience and they're like, I don't, this sounds crazy to me, but everybody around me is biased, so I'm okay with it too. It's almost a conscious thought, and it's just so interesting. And you can see how that just repeats over and over again and why people get stuck in these things. And I think it just makes it even harder to deprogram and get somebody out.
Scott, it's what Robert Cialdini calls social proof. So it's one of the 6 principles of influence that we look around us to understand what to do. So we're at the airport and we go follow the herd to wherever the line is, where we need to be, or we're in an audience and people start standing up and clapping. And so we end up doing the standing ovation. And so we are influenced by what Cialdini calls social proof. We look around us to see what other people are doing, and then we think that's the social proof. That validates what we should do. And
so in that regard, it probably would be really important then to cultivate a deep level of self-trust in order to not be so easily influenced.
Well, it's also important to not allow yourself to be in an environment where you can't do reality testing, where you can't ask critical questions, you can't express doubts, you can't get genuine responses. I mean, when you're in an environment like that, again, unplug, so that you can reflect and really recognize what's going on. Because by design, groups like, Nexium, like, in my opinion, Landmark Education, they create an environment that they control, and they control the narrative, and they control what you perceive to be reality. That's why groups have compounds. That would be an extreme expression of environment control. But it also can be achieved through social isolation. In my opinion, Jehovah's Witnesses, even though they live down the street or next door in an apartment complex or whatever, their meaningful personal life is social isolation.
That's how it was in the Living Word Fellowship, for sure.
Yeah.
We were still a part of the world, air quotes, but the majority of our socializing, probably like 98%, was other members, work days, services. So yeah, that social isolation. Isolation. There you go.
Isolation.
Say it fast 3 times.
Yeah, I mean, social isolation is a huge component of thought reform. I mean, Lifton and Edgar Schein, who was a psychologist, a professor at MIT, he came out with the book Coercive Persuasion in 1951. And then 10 years later, Lifton came out with his seminal book in 1961. What they studied was prisoners in North Korean POW camps. And in the case of Shine, he was basically studying the re-education programs of communist China. So by interviewing people that were ex-prisoners in those kind of systems, they were able to recognize the moving parts of this machine that is thought reform, that is coercive persuasion. What Shine established was that there are 3 phases of coercive persuasion. The first phase he calls unfreezing, or I'd call it just breaking people down, shaming them, bullying them, attacking them, impugning their integrity, just pile it on and break them down, And then the second phase is what Shine would call changing. That is that once the person has been unfrozen and where they're at and who they are, you can then mold them to what you want because they are broken down. So you put them back together as you deem fit, which typically the prototype is the leader. What does the leader think? How does the leader see the world in a cult? That becomes the prototype. And the leader is the icon in that sense. So everyone becomes like the leader, perceiving the world and others like the leader. And then finally, the third phase is refreezing, what Shine calls refreezing, or what I would call lock them in. And what that is the social isolation, the peer reinforcement on an ongoing basis that maintains the changed state and keeps it going indefinitely. I mean, Margaret Singer, who was one of the preeminent cult experts of the 20th century, if not the number one, once said to me, Rick, a cult leader is like a con man. The only difference between a con man and a cult leader is that a con man takes the money and skips town. And a cult leader runs the same con on the same people indefinitely.
Wow.
And in that sense, cult leaders know what they're doing. They know they're running a con. That's how I see it.
Calculated. Yeah. Well, I don't know if Scott has any other questions, but I just want to thank you personally for the work that you do and just let you know that it's made a huge impact on my life. And I know so many other people that found the forum. And for me, it was that first little inroad, into like, oh, maybe I'm not wrong. Maybe this place is a little toxic. So I really just personally appreciate you. And I appreciate all that you do and all that you sacrifice, like with everything that's come against you from people trying to keep you from doing this good work. But, and thank you for talking with us. It's really, really helpful and meaningful.
Yeah, I really like that talking to you is like hearing that there are so many cults that I feel almost surrounded and they're everywhere and I better watch where I step so I don't fall into another one because there's just so much going on. Thanks for listening to Oops, I'm in a Cult.
Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Follow us on Instagram at Oops, I'm in a Cult Podcast.
Support us on Supercast by visiting our website at oopsiminacult.com to subscribe and receive exclusive bonus content.
Or email us at oopsiminacult@gmail.com.
Take it easy and don't join a cult. If you or someone you know has a mental illness, is struggling emotionally, or has concerns about their mental health, there are ways to get help. Use the resources linked in the description to find help for you, a friend, or a family member.